Okay, I'm Hal Varian. I'm the chief economist here at Google, and it's my pleasure to introduce Yoram Bauman. He claims to be the world's only stand-up economist, and I thought, gee, there's a chance for entry here. I could maybe try this myself. And when Ann told me to do the introduction, I said, is that really fair? Because after all, I'm a really tough act to follow. But despite this, I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And what's so hard about being a stand-up economist? After all, you just go to Google and you type in economics jokes. So I tried that, and then a few minutes later I typed in funny economics jokes. and then I tried funny economics jokes I haven't heard, and it just goes on. I realized there's more to it than really met the naked eye. But I did come up with a story that I want to use to introduce him. I'm not sure if this specifically applies to economists, but at least it's a nice academic story. It's about the full professor and the associate professor who are holding a debate about what fraction of sex is fun and what fraction is work. So the full professor says 75% work, 25% fun. The associate professor says, no, it's 50-50. So they're arguing, they're getting citations, they're Googling things. An assistant professor comes by. They ask his opinion. He says, well, I think it's 75% fun and 25% work. So they argue along for a while. Finally, a research assistant comes by. They say, what's your opinion? The research assistant says, this is totally obvious. It's obvious. It's 100% fun. He said, how can you be so sure? He said, well, if there were any work involved, it'd make us do it. So with that, I would like to introduce not the assistant professor, not the associate professor, not the full professor, the dean of economic comedy, Yoram Bauman.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. The setup was a bit long, but the punchline was good. Before I forget, I should show you my T-shirt. It says, stimulate the economy, buy me a drink. I used to wear one that said, enjoy capitalism, sort of in the Coca-Cola lettering. But as long as unemployment is above, whatever, 9%, I think that one's in the closet. I also forget to tell people, here's a joke that I'm really proud of, because it's not very often that you can make up a knock-knock joke, but I made up a knock-knock joke. It's an economics knock-knock joke that's sweeping England, so I have to put on my terrible British accent. Ready? Here we go. Knock-knock. Economist, the financial crisis, but I promise I'll do better next time. And the great thing about that joke is that I'll be able to keep telling that forever, right? Because whatever happens in the world economy, you can be pretty sure that as an economist, I'll be able to say that economist it, right? Anyway, so it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And in Hal's honor, I thought I would start with a piece called What to Expect When You're Expecting the Nobel Prize. So for any of you that are, well, first of all, I should say that I teach part-time at a high school in Seattle, and I share this with my high school students, and I said, do you guys get the joke? And one of them said, isn't there like a baby book called What to Expect When You're Expecting? And I was like, yeah, that's very good. How did you know that? And he said, I saw it in the movie Knocked Up. So that's how education happens these days, I guess. So this is what to expect when you're expecting the Nobel Prize. So first of all, you should expect an early morning phone call from a long dead economist. So when you win the Nobel Prize, just in case you're getting ready for that, they call you up at a reasonable hour Sweden time, I guess, but it's 6 o'clock in the morning East Coast time, 3 o'clock in the morning West Coast time, and they tell you that you won the Nobel Prize. And then a fellow calls up from the Nobel Prize website and does an interview with you that they record and transcribe and then post on their website. So here's some snippets from the Nobel Prize interviews. So the first one is with Edmund Phelps in 2006. And the interview is conducted by the editor-in-chief of NobelPrize.org, whose name you'll see in a moment. So here's the interview. Hello, may I speak to Professor Phelps, please? And he says, who's calling? And the response is, I'm from the Nobel Foundation, and my name is Adam Smith. And Edmund Phelps says, ha, ha, ha. And then Adam Smith says, I know it could be a hoax call with a name like that. It's a terrible burden I carry. So one of the things that you see from these transcripts of these interviews with the Nobel Prize winners is part of what I think Us Weekly should start running a segment called Nobel Prize Winners. They're just like us. So here's more from Edmund Phelps. The question comes in, how are you going to celebrate winning the Nobel Prize? Right, and he says, well, right now I'm thinking about breakfast. And Adam Smith says, yeah, I bet it's got to be a 2-egg day at least. And Edmund Phelps starts talking about cholesterol. Right? I've been scared of cholesterol for a long time. But I understand the white of the egg is quite safe. I'll ask my wife whether perchance she has an egg in the house. One of the funniest exchanges in the transcripts comes from Leonid Hurwitz, who is the oldest person to win the Nobel Prize in any field. So he and his wife Evelyn, and this is their phone call from October of 2007. So the phone call comes in, good morning, Professor Hurwitz. And he says, hello. And the other end says, his wife says he's hard of hearing. Okay. And NobelPrize.org says, I'm sorry, I'll speak louder. Can you hear me now? And his wife says, yes. And then, thank you, my name is Adam Smith, and So these transcripts are actually quite funny, and one of the things that they used to do, that they no longer do, they used to ask the Nobel Prize winner to explain in simple layperson's terms what they won the Nobel Prize for, and they no longer ask them that question, and instead what they do is they tell them what they won the Nobel Prize for, and then they say, is that right? So then all the Nobel Prize winner has to do is say yes. And it actually is one of the challenges there is really explaining, I think, your research in real simple terms. And so I'm here promoting this book, The Cartoon Introduction to Economics, which is a super fun book. It was really fun to work on the book with Grady Klein, who's not an economist, but he now knows a fair amount about economics and is a terrific illustrator. It was a neat format, kind of graphic nonfiction. And one of the fun pieces that we have throughout the book are these cartoons about congratulations, you win the Nobel Prize. So here's Jim Tobin saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And the King of Sweden says, congratulations, you win the Nobel Prize. And this was actually based on a true story, and this was the impetus for this line of jokes, because his obituary in the New York Times told a story about how when he went to accept the Nobel Prize and went to give his at the press conference, the reporter said, well, explain what you won the Nobel Prize for. And he did it for portfolio selection theory, which is about investment stuff. And he said, well, there's alpha and there's beta. And the reporters were like, no, that's too hard, right? Make it simple. And he said, well, it's kind of like don't put all your eggs in one basket. And then headlines around the world the next day said, economist wins Nobel Prize for don't put all your eggs in one basket. So this is a true story, and it was the impetus for the other jokes that we have on this. So here's John Nash, who won for game theory, who's figured out the optimal strategy for rock, paper, scissors. George Akerlof, who won for adverse selection, which is related to individual health insurance markets, saying buying an individual health insurance policy can be a real pain in the neck. Joseph Stiglitz, sometimes the invisible hand is invisible because it's not there, which is actually a classic Joseph Stiglitz line. Daniel Kahneman, human beings are not always rational, and so he's actually a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics for sort of his pioneering work in behavioral economics and looking at, when do people really fulfill sort of the rational model that economists sometimes use. So those are some of the cool panels from the cartoon book. And then here's one. I think my prediction is that that Marty Weitzman from Harvard is going to win one of these days for his work on environmental economics. And since I'm an environmental economist, I always bet on Marty. In the Harvard runs a betting pool every year for the Nobel Prize. So I lost $5 last year because he didn't win, but he did kind of pioneering work on this idea that I'll come back and chat about a little more later on. So I do call myself the world's first and only stand-up economist. I really only have one thing going for me, and that's low expectations. Actually, that's not true. I have one other thing going for me. I get to make fun of macroeconomists. I'm a real economist because I can make fun of subdisciplines that are totally indistinguishable to people on the outside. Like people in Washington State where I live make fun of people in Oregon, people in Alabama make fun of people in Mississippi, people in prison make fun of people in graduate school. I did go through 5 years of graduate school, got my PhD in economics only to decide that I wanted to do stand-up comedy. You can imagine how much this thrilled my father. He told me I'd never make it as a stand-up economist, and I said, why not? And he said, there's no demand. First joke I ever told on stage. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply side economist. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down. I believe in the Laffer curve. You can also tell I'm a real economist because I can translate plain English into incomprehensible gibberish. But briefly, while I was in graduate school, I had the opposite ability. I could translate economic gibberish into plain English, and that's where this next bit I want to do for you comes from. I think some of you may have seen this on YouTube. If you have, don't worry, there's new stuff coming. But this is Mankiw's Principles of Economics. So Greg Mankiw, Harvard professor, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Bush for a couple of years, which I'm guessing is probably not at the top of his resume. Also wrote the best-selling economics textbook in the country. It's based on these 10 principles. I know the font is small, but I generally tell people not to bother reading these. Just take my word that you pretty much need a PhD in economics to understand them. Fortunately, I have one. So I've taken it upon myself to translate these principles for the more fortunate. We're going to begin by separating them into the first 7 principles, which are microeconomics, and the last 3, which are macroeconomics. The difference, of course, being that microeconomists are wrong about specific things, right, and macroeconomists are wrong about things in general. Okay. Beginning with the macro principles 8, 9, and 10, these all have the exact same translation, namely blah, blah, blah. As proof, I need only remind you that macroeconomists have successfully predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. And as further proof, we can now go up 1 font size. So let's go back to the micro principles. The first one, people face trade-offs. The translation here is easy, choices are bad. This is a simple syllogism. Trade-offs are bad. Anytime you have choices, you have trade-offs. Therefore, choices have to be bad. As evidence that I'm actually driving the research literature in economics, here's a paper that came out in 2008 called Why Fewer Options May Be Better. No duh. If you don't understand why choices are bad, though, take a look at the second principle. The cost of something is what you give up to get it. Translation, choices are really bad. Now, I have a simple demonstration of this fact. Let's say that somebody offers you a Snickers bar, right, that you value at $1. Right, then what you can loosely think of as your economic profit in this situation is the dollar of the Snickers bar minus the cost of what you go up to get it, which is nothing. Your economic profit is $1. Thanks, Google. Now, to begin to see why choices are bad, imagine that someone offers you a choice between the Snickers bar that you value at $1, right, and some M&Ms that you value at 70 cents. Okay, now your economic profit is only 30 cents. Okay. You begin to understand why choices are bad. The worst possible situation, in fact, is being offered a choice between a Snickers bar and an identical Snickers bar. Okay. Now, people who are not trained in economics might think that that's no different than just being offered one Snickers bar, but that kind of sloppy thinking will never get you a tenure track position. Summarizing then, choices are bad, choices are really bad. I'm not going to beat around the bush with you people. If you don't understand why choices are bad, you're probably stupid. Okay. Moving on, principle number 3, rational people think at the margin. Translation, people are stupid. Now, it is immediately obvious to the most casual observer with the meanest intelligence that people do not think at the margin. Nobody goes to the grocery store and says, I'm going to buy an orange, I'm going to buy another orange, I'm going to buy another orange. That joke only makes sense to economists. People don't think like that. Right? But if people don't think at the margin, and if, as Mankiw says, rational people do think at the margin, we are led to a most unhappy conclusion. People are not rational. People, in other words, are stupid. But before you despair for humanity, take a look at the next principle. People respond to incentives. Now, the dictionary says that incentive is a noun. That means something that influences to action, synonym motive. So when Mankiw says that people respond to incentives, what he's saying is that people are motivated by motives. You might think this is a bit like saying that tautologies are tautological, right? I mean, people would have to be pretty stupid to be unmotivated by motives. But remember principle 3. People are stupid. Hence the need for principle 4 to tell us that people aren't that stupid. Summarizing again, we move on to every economist's favorite topic, free trade. Principle 5, trade can make everyone better off. Translation, trade can make everyone worse off. You may wonder how the translation of principle 5 is the opposite of the principle itself. I have a simple proof of this fact that will blow your mind. Here we go. I want you to compare 2 statements. One of them is trade can make everyone better off, and the other one is trade will make everyone better off. Now, if you had to pick one of those 2 statements to put in your best-selling economics textbook, right, it's no contest. The second statement is clearly better. But Mankiw uses the first statement instead. And if you think about why, there's only one possible explanation. The second statement has got to be wrong. Okay. In other words, trade can make some people worse off, and from there it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to trade can make everyone worse off. I figured some of you had some questions about this, so I added a footnote with some details. Eat your heart out. Now that we've cleared that up, I want you to see that the last two principles follow immediately from Principle 5 in its translation. Right? Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. In other words, governments are stupid. Governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. Governments aren't that stupid. Follow immediately from 5 in its translation. If trade can make everyone better off, then what the heck do we need government for? Just let people trade. Right? But if trade can make everyone worse off, we better have a government around to stop people from trading. Right? So there are the 10 principles of economics translated. And what I want you to notice here is how subtle economics is. Right? Like, people are stupid, but they're not that stupid. Governments are stupid, but they're not that stupid. The only thing that's not subtle in economics is that choices are always really, really bad. So I filmed this at a science convention and put it up on my website, standupeconomist.com, and also on YouTube a couple years ago, not thinking very much of it. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that it's heading for 1 million hits on YouTube, which is a lot for economics jokes. Okay? Not a lot for videos about, like, puppies. Okay? But it's a lot for economics jokes, and many of the hits are because the video was posted on Greg Mankiw's blog. It turns out that he's a fan of my parody, or at the very least comes from the "there's no such thing as bad publicity" school of thought. And in fact, I got to perform in his class at Harvard. He teaches the introductory Ec 10 class at Harvard, and I got to perform in his class as the last leg of my 2008 supply side world tour, which was mostly a trip to Israel with my father. But as long as I was there, I did some comedy, and then on my way back, I stopped at Greg's class at Harvard, and he told us he wasn't going to tell his students that I was coming. He just said there was a surprise guest who was coming to class. But then he had to tell them that I was coming because some students came to his office hours and said that there was a rumor going around campus that Ben Bernanke was coming to class. I like to think that they got the better end of the deal on that one, but... So this routine is what I like to think of as part of a renaissance in economics humor. The idea of a renaissance or resurgence in economics humor may come as a surprise to those of you who didn't know that there was ever a first surgence of economics humor. But in fact there was. It was in the 70s and the early 80s. It included papers like A Theory of Interstellar Trade by Paul Krugman, which is a fabulous paper, and I'm thrilled to say that we're going to be publishing it in Economic Inquiry 30 years or whatever after he wrote it. So Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago for his work on trade theory, and he's also a big fan of science fiction. And this paper is about if you have interstellar trade, so if you have trade between solar systems, then you probably have spaceships that are traveling close to the speed of light, so you no longer have time simultaneity. So the question is, which clocks do you use for calculating interest rates? The clocks on the spaceships or the clocks on the planets? Truly an amazing, hilarious, fabulous paper. One I think, in my professional opinion, it's one of the top 2 funniest economics papers of all time. The other contestant being this one, Life Among the Econ by Axel Unpronounceable, which is a fake anthropology paper about the Econ tribe that lives in the bleak north. That also came out in Economic Inquiry. I'm happy to say that I'm the humor editor, the miscellany editor for Economic Inquiry. So if any of you have economics-related funny papers, then send them my way. I tend to get things from folks who have funny economics papers, or more often people who think that they have funny economics papers. Tell you about some more recent developments in the world of economics comedy. This paper called Japan's Phillips Curve looks like Japan. So if you need a refresher on the Phillips curve, it was this idea that came out in the 50s and 60s that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You can have high inflation, low unemployment, or vice versa, but somewhere you're always along that Phillips curve line. Right, and then in the 70s and 80s, we had stagflation, high inflation, also high unemployment. Robert Lucas developed the theory of rational expectations. Economists realized it was more complicated everywhere except in Japan. So this paper was named the funniest economics paper of 2008. There was considerable competition for that. And it was written by Canadian Gregor Smith. And one of the great things about this paper is it's linked from his website, and the link on his website says that the title of the paper is also the abstract and, frankly, most of the text. Which is pretty much what we should be aiming for in all academic papers, I think. The rest of the paper is taken up by this graph here. So on the y-axis, on the x-axis, we have the unemployment rate in Japan between 1980 and 2005. On the y-axis, we have the inflation rate. For ease of viewing, the author rotates this around the y-axis, right? And then there's a map of Japan. Extremely impressive research. Tell you a little bit of my own research in economics humor. So first of all, this paper is called Incentive Compatibility in the Hospital. So this is an example of what's called a pain scale. This is an actual thing that doctors and nurses use to communicate with patients. Like if they don't share a common language, at least you can point and indicate how much pain you're in. So in the U.S., healthcare accounts for about 16% of GDP. That hurts a whole lot. It's roughly like 1.5 to 2 times more than most other rich countries pay for healthcare. And compounding the problem is that a lot of those resources are wasted because of things that health economists study, like adverse selection or moral hazard. Or the particular issue that I'm going to focus on today is patients who are malingering. So malingering is an actual medical phenomenon. Stereotypically, somebody who's lonely, they'll just go to the hospital and complain of low back pain just so someone will pay attention to them. And this happens enough that medical professionals have tests for malingering. So there's what's called the axial load test. So if you complain of low back pain, they might push down on your head like this and ask you if the pain is getting worse, right? And if you go, ow, 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 right, then they know that you're faking it. Okay, 'cause physiologically, it's not possible to have enhanced low back pain as a result of that axial load. But my question is, why can't we just use economic incentives instead, what economists call incentive compatibility? So my modest proposal is that instead of asking people this question, how much does the pain hurt, instead we should just ask them, how much would you be willing to pay to make the pain go away? Okay. And then you just pick a bubble. So macroeconomics, I mentioned Robert Lucas a few minutes ago. He won the Nobel Prize for his work on rational expectations. So I have what I modestly call the Lucas-Bauman hypothesis. Modestly, because I could have called it the Bauman-Lucas hypothesis. Let me show you what it says graphically. If we look at the amount of knowledge that we have about macroeconomics that we've gained over the last 150 years, right, it's been a steady upward trend. But if we look at our level of understanding of the macroeconomy, it's been flat. Okay. The Lucas-Bauman hypothesis explains why, the answer, of course, being that advances in macroeconomics produce complexities in the macroeconomy, think like credit default swaps, that offset the theoretical advances. Right? Or in very simple layperson's terms, macroeconomics is pointless. Okay. Finally, some more economics and global warming. So this is what I work on when I'm being an academic. So I'll tell some jokes, and then I'll tell a little bit of serious stuff, and then I'll go back and tell some more jokes at the end. So there are a bunch of economists who work on climate change. I'm one of them, and there are folks who also do cost-benefit analysis modeling of climate change. The most famous model is Bill Nordhaus's model at Yale. It's called the DICE model, the Dynamic Integrated Model of Climate in the Economy. A few years ago, he came up with a regional version of this model that is, of course, called the RICE model. For obvious reasons, there's no local version of this model. I have my own model of climate in the economy. It's called the value-laden, assumption-laden, nicely linear approximation integrated model of climate in the economy, or the vanilla ice model. The vanilla ice model has some theory, it has some policy. So the theory actually goes back to this footnote here, right, about trade making everyone worse off. And it's actually true in a very made-up economics model sort of way that you can have a situation where trade makes everyone worse off. And since this is related to climate change, I'm just going to talk you through this for a minute. So imagine we live in a small town, right? Small town has just 3 people in it, orange, pink, and blue. They all live in this town. Town has an air pollution problem, and they're all good Americans, so they each have a garage full of stuff that they don't use. Right, so now we're going to see some trades. So first, orange is going to sell a lawnmower, let's say, to pink. Right, they both get $100 in value from the trade. Orange sells the lawnmower for $100 that was just sitting in her garage. Pink values the lawnmower $200. She only has to pay $100 for it, so she gets $100 in net benefits. The problem is that when Pink starts using the lawnmower, that was just sitting in Orange's garage, right, you get a little bit of air pollution in the town. And again, this is a made-up economics model, right? So maybe there's health impacts that we could monetize at like $80 per person, right? Not just for orange and pink, but also for blue, right? The negative externality in this case. So note that orange and pink are going to continue to make the trade because they each get $20 in net benefits, right? So now we'll see another trade. Pink sells something to blue, a snowblower. They each get $100 in value from the trade. Pink from selling the snowblower for $100. Blue values it at $200. She only has to pay $100. Right, but when blue starts using the snowblower that was just sitting in Pink's garage, air pollution gets worse, maybe an additional $80 in healthcare costs for everybody. and now we can just complete the circle. Blue sells a leaf blower to orange. They get $100 in benefits. Air pollution gets worse. An additional $80 in healthcare costs for everyone. And now if you add up any one of these columns, right, you see that the sum of all three of those trades together leaves everybody at minus 40. Right, so this is the tragedy of the commons, the prisoner's dilemma, and the economic idea here is that each of those people's trades are individually rational. If you ask them if they want to take back any of the trades that they engaged in, they'll say no. Because they get $20 in net benefits each for each trade that they are engaged in. But altogether, the trades end up hurting everyone. If you want to belabor the point and make a connection to climate change, we could, I don't know, like label the people or something. So this is kind of the economic model, a very simple model of the way that economists think about climate change. I'll mention a couple things about climate change. So I'm not a climate scientist, but I do hang out with climate scientists at the University of Washington and elsewhere. So one thing to note is carbon emissions are going up. People are very good at burning fossil fuels. Projected to double roughly between 1990 and 2030, and a lot of that growth is coming in the developing world. Right? So the red and the green here are the U.S. and the rest of the rich world. The purple is China, and the yellow is the rest of the developing world. So very rapid projections for increasing CO2 emissions, especially in the developing part of the world. Second thing you need to know is just the basics of the greenhouse effect. So you probably learned this from Al Gore, right? But the idea is that you got energy in from the sun, and then some of that energy gets radiated back out into space. And greenhouse gases are this blanket of heat-trapping gases that partially reflect some of that outgoing radiation back to the Earth. This is not controversial among scientists anyway, and one of the first people to work on this was this fellow Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden in 1896. He did the first estimate of what would temperatures, by how much temperatures would go up if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere. And his point estimate is still in the range that climate scientists talk about today. One big difference between where he was and where we are now is that he thought climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden in 1896. And we think it's probably going to be a little less awesome these days. And here's temperature trends. So you may see a lot of stuff in the media about what's going on with temperatures. And temperatures bounce around a lot, but they're going up pretty much just like the climate scientists projected by about 0.2, 0.15 degrees centigrade per decade. And that's projected to continue for the next couple of decades. If you don't believe in climate change, that's okay. I'll find common ground with you anyway. But it's worth just keeping an eye on the temperature projections. One of the cool things about science is they make testable predictions, right? And so if you don't believe in climate change, you just kind of wait 5 or 10 years and then see what happens. So the economics of climate change, which I work on, is pretty simple. It's based that's the policy part of the vanilla ice model, and the policy part is based on a simple idea, right? Which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive, right? And you can do that. Sort of economists talk about two flavors of that. One of them is like a carbon tax. The other one is an auction cap and trade system. We tend to think that they're pretty similar, more similar than they are different. And in both cases, the goal of those policies is to raise the price of fossil fuels so that you get capitalism and free market economics and stuff working to develop alternatives to promote conservation, all of the great stuff that's the power of free enterprise, and trying to get that to work for the environment. So what I work on as an economist is how do we use the tools of economics to protect the environment. Fossil fuel prices are going to go up, and lots of folks will like to get they'd like to get all that innovation and clean energy and stuff without fossil fuel prices going up, and I happen to think that that's going to be real hard. I think you're going to need the price signal to make that happen. There's a little bit of good news, and the good news is that with either of these systems, with a carbon tax or with auction, cap, and trade, you get a pile of money. Right? And you can do great stuff with that pile of money. You probably have your own ideas about spending it on mass transit or clean energy research or whatever. What I talk to folks about is the idea of using it to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So environmental tax reform, revenue neutral tax shift are some of the names that folks talk about. Right? And the underlying idea here is that for economists, the way that you should organize a tax system is you should start by taxing things that you want less of instead of taxing things that you want more of. Right? So right now we tax employment, we tax savings, we tax investment. Those are all things that we'd like to have more of. So we shouldn't be discouraging them. So we should get rid of some of those taxes and instead have taxes on carbon emissions and things that we want less of. So the underlying vision here that I go around and talk to folks about is that we could be replacing part of our tax code with carbon pricing, and there's actually a great model for this north of where I am in Seattle in the province of British Columbia. They did this. There was the premier there actually from a right-of-center party, implemented a $30 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, so that's like 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, so that's not nothing. And then used the money, 100% of the money went to rebate personal and corporate income taxes at the provincial level in a way that sort of offset impacts on low-income households. And it was super great policy. So I'm working with some folks in Washington State to probably run a ballot measure or something there. I can always dream to make that happen in Washington, and it's something that you could do here in California also, right? And it would be a great thing for all sorts of reasons. Even if you don't believe in climate change, there are national security reasons, right, for wanting to reduce the dependence on foreign oil, right, and the world market price of oil, and probably the best story I have about this is, I mentioned earlier I teach at a high school in Seattle. It's a fancy private school, and they brought George Will in, the Washington Post columnist, to talk to the students. And he doesn't even believe that climate change is caused by human activity. But I asked him if he would support replacing the payroll tax with a carbon tax, and he said yes. And he actually said that his words were he would favor replacing the payroll tax with a yogurt tax. Is what he said. But I don't care why he supports it, right? It's just the idea that he happens to hate the payroll tax so much that he's happy to replace it with something that's roughly like a consumption tax, which a lot of economists think is a pretty good idea. So there's kind of support at least across the economic spectrum, if not the political spectrum, for this idea, and it's one that it's one that I'm going to spend my life talking to people about, so that's why I'm talking about it with you all, so thanks for bearing with me. I'll tell you some jokes now, and then we'll have some time for questions about serious stuff or about comedy. It's been an amazing year for economics comedy, so let me just tell you the top 5 stories in the last year in economics comedy. Number 5 story, I got to be on the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Yeah, thank you. Now, I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy, but let me just tell you this, people. In the world of stand-up comedy, it does not get any bigger than the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. I'm getting phone calls nonstop on my rotary dial telephone. It was actually in San Francisco. They interviewed me at the Economic Association meeting there, and it was pretty amazing. They interviewed Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize, and they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. I only tell that joke because her book is outselling mine. And what did they ask me on my moment of TV fame? They asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage, right? And I had to confess to them that, in fact, I had bombed on stage, the worst show I ever did. Right? Comedy is a violent business. You either kill or you bomb. Right? And the worst show I ever did was in October of 2008. If you remember what the stock market was doing in October of 2008, I did a show for some bankers in Colorado Springs. Right? Terrible. Did terrible. And I actually did so poorly that I spent a lot of time afterwards kind of soul-searching, like trying to figure out what had gone wrong with this audience of bankers in Colorado Springs in October of 2008. And I finally realized that I lost them. Like, where did I lost them? And I realized that I lost them on my opening line. And my opening line was, "Hey, how's it going?" Apparently it wasn't going very well. That was actually a really interesting time to be doing comedy because October of 2008 was also right before the election. And in late October of 2008, I had the pleasure of doing some comedy in Wichita, Kansas, which I found out quickly was on kind of the conservative end of the conservative wing of the conservative spectrum. And I found this out because I sat down for dinner there with some folks I was doing comedy for, and by way of introduction, one of the women at my table said that she was afraid that if Obama was elected president, she was afraid that in 5 years she was going to be wearing a burqa. True story. So after the election, I sent her a catalog. And I put a note on the catalog, and the note said, "Look, I'm not trying to rub it in. It's just that the economy needs you to buy the burqa now." Can't wait 5 years for you to buy the burqa. So that's number 5 story in economics comedy. Number 4 story, competition from Austin Goolsbee. So Austin Goolsbee is one of Obama's chief economic advisors. As Hal mentioned, as I said earlier, I like to call myself the world's first and only stand-up economist. So you can imagine how I reacted when somebody sent me this from the Wall Street Journal blog. Austin Goolsby, stand-up economist. It turns out he's been named like the funniest Politico in D.C. Here's a picture of him doing a little set at the D.C. Improv. Fortunately, I come from two fields, stand-up comedy and economics, where we tend to think that competition is pretty awesome. Right? And so what I did was I posted a note on my blog inviting him to come to the American Economic Association humor session, right? And perform there. Right? I said that I welcome competition, even from the government, right? Especially from the government. And I told him we even have a name for his act. We would call it Stand-Up Economics, the Public Option. He didn't come. But he did say he might come after he finishes his work in D.C. So that was the number 4 story. Number 3 story, I was in discussions with Fox Business Network about having a regular show on the Fox Business Network. Don't get too impressed. The discussions didn't go anywhere. It turned out that they didn't need my help in order to become a joke. Number 2 story is the book that I have out, right, the Cartoon Introduction to Economics. I'm working on the macro book. And I'm happy to say that lots of economists have said nice things about the book. In particular, Greg Mankiw called it a painless way to learn economics, which I thought was especially generous of Greg, given what I said about his book, right, in my parody. I mean, I think that really the only thing that I could have done that would have been meaner to Greg Mankiw would have been to post something on my blog calling his book a painful way to learn economics. Which I didn't do, but still, it was very nice of him to call my book A Painless Way to Learn Economics. And you can draw all sorts of conclusions from this, that he's a nice guy, that he's forgiving. The conclusion that I draw is that Greg Mankiw is not a game theorist. And I know this because we sent the book out. So we sent the book out for blurbs to a bunch of folks to try to get blurbs for the back of the book. And one of them was a famous game theorist whose name shall not be mentioned here. But here's the email that came back from famous game theorist about the blurb. It says, Yoram, the book is great. Okay, how about this blurb? This book is not funny at all. You can really see how game theorists think, right? Because in his mind, this is an awesome blurb for the back of the book. He goes on to say, readers are likely to understand basic economic ideas much better than they would from books full of equations and real-life examples. To this day, I still have no idea whether or not famous game theorists actually liked the book. I should say at this point, we also sent a galley of the book to Hal Varian, trying to get a quote from him for the back of the book. My apologies to Hal. The quote did not make the back of the book. You can judge for yourselves whether that was appropriate or not. But Hal Varian's quote for the back of the book was that it was. He said nice things about the book and said that the book put the cartoon before the course. Stand up and take a bow, Hal. Excellent. So that's the number 2 story in economics comedy. And the number 1 story in economics comedy, I run a humor session every year at the American Economic Association meeting. And the next one is going to be in Denver. It's going to be 8 p.m., January 8, 2011. It's the only session at the American Economic Association meeting that is free and open to the public. And so you're all invited. The session that we did this last year in Atlanta was super fun. I was there. A woman who's a grad student at Harvard named Jody Beggs was there. She runs a website called economists.doitwithmodels.com. A fellow named Hugo Milan, who's up for tenure next month at Emory, presented a paper on the economics of faking orgasms. And a fellow who's a financial analyst by day, and by night he sings country music songs about economics under the stage name of Merle Hazard. So he performed, and we had a super fun time. So I invite you all to come out to Denver in January of 2011. Thank you for bringing me here for the day. This has been fabulous, and I have time to take questions if there are some questions. And if you have to go work or stuff, then you can do that too. And can you use? Yeah, sure. You can use this mic for questions, and I will go to the podium.
Okay. Anyway, thanks. Any questions?
I suppose I should plug my website too. So standupeconomist.com is my website. There's my email. You can get on my mailing list and stuff like that.
So, come to the mic so we can hear on YouTube or DC. You just knocked out. Hey, how about
So I'll break the ice. What's the funniest thing you found on Google?
What's the funniest thing that I found on Google? I don't know. I think probably the funniest thing that comes to mind right now is apparently I'm sure you all know about this, but there's something called "Let me Google that for you," which one of my TAs told me about because they get emails from students that are like, "How do I find out the population of Japan?" And so I guess there's this website out there that's called "Let me Google that for you," where it's, whatever code it is, where you can send them an email or a website address, and at the website it actually types in for them. Like when you go to the website, it types in google.com, and then it types in the question, like, what's the population of Japan? And then it kicks up the answer for them. So.
Anybody else?
I could just tell more jokes for 15 minutes. Feel it.
Wait.
Oh, you got to take the mic.
Yeah.
On your mailing list, do you have a separate mailing list for your research as opposed to your stand-up comedy?
I don't have a mailing list for my research. I'm a pretty bad economist and I'm a pretty bad comedian, but I'm a pretty good economics comedian. So I have a little bit of time for research. If you're really interested, like I'm one of the world experts on the impacts of climate change on dairy production in the Pacific Northwest. So if that happens to be something that you're super passionate about, then drop me a line. I do a little bit of research, mostly co-authored with folks who are smarter than I am. We did a paper on whether one of my colleagues at University of Washington, Elena Rose, and I just came out with a working paper on whether taking economics classes makes people selfish. So that.
It's definitely true.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I could do 10 more minutes of comedy unless you have questions.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, more questions.
Question relating to that. Could you tell us like a few more jokes for the next 10, 15 minutes?
Do you want to hear more jokes? All right.
All right.
I do magic tricks. I don't do magic tricks. All right, so I'll tell you that. So when I started doing comedy, I did a little bit of economics jokes, and then I started going to open mic nights at the Comedy Underground in Seattle. One of the great things about comedy is that there's no barriers to entry. Like anybody just shows up on Sunday night and puts your name down on the list, and you get 2 minutes at open mic night, which is also why most people don't make any money from doing stand-up comedy. So I quickly realized that I had to start doing some routines that weren't just about economics. I needed something easier to do jokes about. This was in 2004. So I started doing some jokes about the war in Iraq that I thought would appeal to people across the political spectrum. So I'll do those for you now, and we'll see whether you still like them. The challenge with those jokes is that it's really hard to find a political spectrum in America. Like everywhere you go is either far left or far right or whatever. So with your permission, and this is the audience participation part of the afternoon, I'm going to divide you up across the political spectrum. So you folks over here on my left, just for the next couple of minutes, I need you guys to participate. You guys are going to be my left wing. That was actually an appropriate amount of enthusiasm for the left wing. Watch this, though. You folks over here to my right, all you folks over here, I need you to participate. You guys get to be my right wing. That was good, but I need you guys to dig down and find your inner red meat, okay? Put yourselves in the mind frame of people who believe in social Darwinism, but Put yourselves in the mind frame of people who believe in social Darwinism but don't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay? You guys over here, you guys are my right wing. That was a little better, but when I did this in Texas last month, they started chanting USA. I want you to do that for me. You guys are my right wing. USA, USA, USA. That was okay. You guys on the left wing, though, you guys were perfect. Because while the right wing was chanting USA, you were just sitting there looking befuddled and vaguely unpatriotic. Don't know how that happens to the left wing. It always does. I haven't forgotten about you people. You all are the most important part of the political spectrum. You're the swing voters. Right? Your job is to be clueless and apathetic and then every 4 years you determine the fate of the free world. Okay? I know it sounds like a big responsibility, but don't give it a second thought. You guys are like the idiot savants of democracy. Of course, the most amusing parts of the political spectrum are the far extremes. So the far right of the political spectrum, you folks over there by the cafe and stuff, you guys get to be my libertarians. That's cool. You can do what you want. Far left of the political spectrum on this wall over here, far left, you guys get to be my libertarians. Did you swing voters get that joke? Libertarians, and not the people that check books out for you. Libertarians are freedom lovers, right? They come in two flavors, right? They're right-wing libertarians. They want everyone to be free to have guns. Okay? Left-wing libertarians, they want everyone to be free to have drugs. Both wings of the Libertarian Party want to abolish Social Security, right? Which makes total sense, because who's going to make it to 65? When the world is full of pistol-packing potheads. All right, I promised you some jokes about the war that appeal to people across the political spectrum, so let me start with this. I'm going to do these jokes at West Point next week, so I'm going to try them out on you. I don't care how you feel about the war. I don't care how you feel about President Bush or President Obama. I think the individual troops over there deserve our support, so I hope you join me in a round of applause. Nice work, left wing. I can't believe I have to give a disclaimer before asking for a round of applause for the troops, but the political situation in this country, ladies and gentlemen, has become so divisive. I experienced that divisiveness firsthand a few years ago when I moved from liberal Seattle to conservative Eastern Washington with a bumper sticker on my car. I brought a copy to show you here. The bumper sticker said, "Bring the troops home." Not a big deal in Seattle, right? But after getting my butt kicked multiple times outside of Barnaby's pub in Walla Walla, I decided I needed to do something different to fit in, right? So I traded in that bumper sticker. I got a new bumper sticker that said, "Leave the troops there." That one didn't work either. So then I went for something neutral. Right, I got a bumper sticker that said, "I don't know about the troops." Yes, I am selling these bumper stickers. And can I just say that this is going much better than when I did this routine in Texas last month? Because when I did this routine in Texas, this great big dude jumped up in the back and he was like, "That is the most offensive bumper sticker I've ever seen." Right? Well, maybe I've been hanging out with economists too long or something, but I took that as a challenge. I looked at him and I said, "You think that's the most offensive bumper sticker you've ever seen?" And I reached into my bag and I said, "Apparently you haven't seen this one. It says, if the troops weren't all in Iraq, I'd shoot one myself." Now this, I said, this is an offensive bumper sticker. This guy in Texas, ladies and gentlemen, you should have seen the look on his face. I mean, I knew that I had won the argument about which was the more offensive bumper sticker. What I didn't know was that he was going to be an incredibly sore loser. Apparently what I thought of as my rights under the First Amendment were in conflict with what he thought of as his rights under the Second Amendment. But I don't back down, people. So when this guy asked me if I was selling this bumper sticker too, I said, "Heck yes, how many would you like to buy?" He flipped out. He jumped up on the stage. He ripped the bumper sticker out of my hand. He got right up in my face. He said, "I would never buy that bumper sticker and put it on my car." And I said, "You dummy. You're not supposed to put it on your own car." It's got instructions right on the back. Step 1, locate Hummer. Step 2, place over gas tank. Step 3, run. Sometimes people doubt my patriotism when I do that routine, so let me be clear about my point. Right, if you're driving a Humvee around Baghdad, I want to thank you for the sacrifices that you're making for our country. Okay? If you're driving a Humvee around the Bay Area, I want to put my foot up your ass. Okay? I totally support the troops. I have extra respect for the troops because I'd be such a terrible fit for the military. No, I mean, look at my arms. I'm like human veal. If I went to boot camp, I'd be afraid the drill sergeant would tell me to drop and give him 5 push-ups. And as far as the military is concerned, I only have one thing going for me. I'm not openly homosexual. But if they reinstate the draft, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to change. It is going to change in a snap. It's not just me, though, because that's the military's policy, right? If you're out, you can't get in. You can't even get by if you're bi. So if they reinstate the draft, gay is going to be the new Canada. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.